Welcome to Tell Us How You Lived, Unearthing Union Mills History, sponsored by the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority and Union Mills Homestead, hosted by Carroll County Public Library in collaboration with the Community Media Center. I'm Dorothy Stoltz, Director for Community Engagement with Carroll County Public Library. Before we introduce our guest speakers, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Our online housekeeping includes, if you are joining us by Zoom, please use the Q&A. You can find the Q&A by hovering your mouse at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You'll see a Q&A icon. When you click on that, a small screen will pop up and you can type in your question or comment there. Now, if you're joining us by Zoom, please use the chat box for your questions and comments. We'll get to as many questions as we can this evening. The recording of the program will be posted to the library's YouTube page. To quote Ralph Waldo Emerson, "The whole value of history is to increase my self-trust by demonstrating what man can be and do." Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sam Riley, President of Union Mills Homestead.
Thank you, Dorothy. And I'm so glad to have you all here this evening. This evening's presentation really is a critical moment for the Union Mills Homestead. It's a major milestone, much as a teenager getting a driver's license or a college student getting a degree on graduation. For the first time, we have a detailed external review of our site, its historical resources, and the larger so what that is just so important for our site interpretation, credibility among historians, and as a guide for future planning. The need for this research was identified in a museum assessment program report prepared back in 2017. And the inspiration actually goes much farther back to a former Homestead board president, Chuck Ives. In many ways, we can dedicate this program to Chuck's memory as he died in 2012 before being able to realize many of his initiatives. I should take a moment to thank all those who played a part in making this evening possible. First of all, to all our supporters on the funding end of this that made it possible, in particular, the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority, which provided a grant that funded this project. Jen Ruffner from MHAA is online with us this evening. Thank you, Jen, for all you do. I'd also like to thank the Board of Governors of the Union Mills Homestead who launched this project, and all of those who were involved in our map project back in 2017, including Curator Chair Helen McSherry and Dr. Thomas Mackey, who's the director of the Abraham Lincoln Library and Museum, who's our mentor for that project. And I'd like to thank Rick Ortega, a structural engineer who specializes in historic structures, who provided the preservation assessment that is part of this report. I'd like to thank our county government, which is always so supportive of our initiatives, and the Carroll County Public Library, which is hosting the event this evening. And finally, and probably most importantly, the Community Media Center, which is broadcasting the event for us this evening. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists this evening. It's a talented team assembled by Elizabeth Comer. Elizabeth Anderson Comer is an archaeologist and is the lead investigator for this project. Elizabeth has successfully managed more than 350 archival and archaeological surveys, testing and excavation projects, and historic surveys and evaluations. She served as the city archaeologist for the city of Baltimore. And there she directed and managed the archaeological department for the city and specialized in complex industrial and waterfront projects. She is the principal of EAC Archaeology, Inc., located in Baltimore. And the team she has assembled is incredibly impressive. And I won't eat into their time anymore by reciting credentials, but suffice to say, this team has extensive experience in multidisciplinary cultural resource management. Both Elizabeth and Paula Reed, who's with us this evening, have authored books on industrial topics critical to our region. So without further ado, let's turn it over to Elizabeth Comer and her team.
About Union Mills. I'd like to introduce our team. I'm Elizabeth Comer. I'm the principal investigator for this project. And I'm joined by Paul Albert, the University of Maryland graduate student and archaeologist, Dr. Robert Wanner, an archaeologist and GIS specialist, Dr. Paula Stoner Reed, our chief architectural historian, and also Patrick Kim and Augustus Call, who worked on the GIS and as archaeologists on this project. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about why EAC Archaeology became involved in this undertaking. Our scope of work asked us to look at Union Mills as a potential national historic landmark. And this quest began with a 2017 Museum Assessment Program report, and then a grant from the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority that funded our research. The work that we undertook at Union Mills is part of what we call Cultural Resource Management, or CRM, in the United States. It began really with the Antiquities Act in 1906, and then with the formation of the first National Park Service in the world, and it was in the United States, of course, in 1916. During the Depression, there was the Historic American Buildings Survey, started in 1933, followed closely by the Historic Sites Act in 1935. And then finally, during the Johnson administration in 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act and Section 106 were passed. And these laws protect the cultural resources below ground archaeologically and above ground architecturally throughout the United States. As part of this project, we were asked to deliver two things. First, a Phase 1A archaeological assessment of the Union Mills property, and two, a historic resource study, or HRS. And those are the items we'll be talking to you, sharing with you tonight. I'd like to take just a moment to talk about the preservation hierarchy in the United States, the difference between the National Register of Historic Places and a National Historic Landmark. So I'm sure you're familiar with the National Register of Historic Places. It was first introduced in 1966 as part of the National Historic Preservation Act. It is a comprehensive list of cultural resources throughout the United States determined to be important to local, state, tribal, or national history. It includes historic districts such as Union Mills. So in order to be determined eligible or listed on the National Register of Historic Places, a site must have integrity of location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. And it also must meet one of the four following criteria. It must meet the criterion A, which is associated with an event which made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. An example of that would be the Liberty Bell. Or criterion B, associated with a person, the life of a person significant in our past. So an example there would be Mount Vernon with George Washington. Criterion C, the design or construction, the architectural consideration. And for that, I always like to use the example of Washington Dulles International Airport. And for criterion D, the information potential, those are often archaeological sites where the information is contained under the ground, and only through excavation is that information brought forward and understood. There are approximately 95,000 properties listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and they represent 1.8 million contributing resources as of 2019. So above the National Register for Historic Places in the hierarchy is a National Historic Landmark. There are only 2,600 listed National Historic Landmarks in the United States. This program was established in 1960, designated by the Secretary of the Interior for the National Park Service. And the sites have to have national significance. This is really what separates a National Historic Landmark from a property that's listed on or eligible for listing on the National Register. And it is just this quest that we were tasked with undertaking at Union Mills, the National Historic Landmark status potential. So that's what we're going to share with you this evening.
I'd like to begin by talking about typical research methodologies in cultural resource management. In our research approach to Union Mills, we employed two primary modes of background investigation: archival research and mapping. Archival research takes place at many different scales, from the local to the county, state, and finally federal levels. Each repository offered something unique in our investigation of Union Mills. At the local level, the Union Mills Homestead Foundation displays primary source documents from the Schreiber family at the homestead itself. Also available is the Schreiber Family Green Book, which details the family's genealogical and oral history. The Green Book is available online through the Homestead Foundation's website. At the county level, the Carroll County Historical Society maintains collections of historical photographs and maps, including early 20th century photos of the Union Mills Tannery complex. The Maryland State Archives maintains governmental records, including land titles, probate records, death and marriage certificates, tax assessment records, and many more. For this project, probate and tax assessment records were particularly useful. Probate records include last wills and testaments, which can be helpful in untangling complicated family genealogies and also assist in understanding how property is transferred from one family member to another over time. Probate records can also include probate inventories, which are itemized lists of possessions that a deceased person owned at the time of their death. These inventories allow researchers to gain a solid understanding of material culture and property ownership in the past. Tax assessment records can consist of a person's taxable, real, and personal property. This can be helpful to archaeologists if the tax assessments include mentions or even descriptions of buildings on the subject property at any given time. These types of records also span quite a large time frame in terms of historical research, from the 1790s through the late 1940s for Union Mills specifically. The Maryland Center for History and Culture, formerly the Maryland Historical Society, includes a vast collection of primary source documents relating to the Schreiber family. These records include diaries, correspondence, business ledgers, and family histories. The vast majority of this collection was donated by the Schreiber family or the Union Mills Homestead Foundation. Finally, research conducted in the Federal Archives for this project garnered historical aerial photographs from the late 1930s, which we rectified with modern satellite imagery to track changes in the landscape over time. The second part of our dual approach to background research on Union Mills site includes mapping, which Dr. Wanner will go over in more detail later in this presentation. Briefly, we utilize GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, to rectify historical maps and atlases with modern satellite imagery, again to track changes in the landscape over time, and also use GIS to help reconstruct the historical landscape at Union Mills. We also employed LiDAR to assist in detecting areas of archaeological sensitivity or potential. Now that we've given a relatively brief overview of why EACA was involved and how we carry out historical research, I'd like to situate the site in its geographical and historical contexts. The Union Mills Homestead complex is located in northern Carroll County, to the north of Westminster, just a few miles south of the Pennsylvania border. The figure on the right includes 3 levels of site definition: the National Register Historic District boundaries in red, the main activity area in blue, and the easement held by the Maryland Historical Trust in pink. The National Register boundary for the Union Mills Homestead Historic District consists of portions of 60 individual tax parcels comprising 274.42 total acres. The historic district was established in 1970 and includes 20th century houses that clearly are not relevant to the Union Mills story. As such, the Phase 1A investigation, which Elizabeth mentioned earlier, focused on the main area of domestic and industrial activity within the Union Mills complex. This main activity area comprises 8 individual tax parcels and the roads between them, covering a total of approximately 70 acres. Based on extensive research, all of the industrial and domestic buildings associated with the Union Mills complex in both the past and present appear to fall within the boundaries of this main activity area. A total of 16 extant buildings are situated within these 7 parcels. The main activity area includes the Schreiber family homestead, the grist mill and miller's house, the extant bark shed, scale house, and reconstructed drying shed of the site's tannery complex, a transported Bowman design bridge, an intact privy, an early 20th century garden feature, and parts of the mill race and historic roadways, all to the north of the Littlestown Turnpike. To the south of the Turnpike, the main activity area includes Avalon, the William Schreiber residence, and the former location of the BF Fibre Company. The Maryland Historical Trust also maintains an easement on part of the complex, which includes the homestead, grist mill, miller's house, and several outbuildings. I'd like to turn now to a discussion of the site's history to more firmly place Union Mills within its historical and cultural contexts. The progenitor of the Schreiber line in America was Andrew Schreiber, grandfather of Andrew and David Schreiber Jr., who would go on to found Union Mills. Andrew Schreiber immigrated to Pennsylvania from Alsenborn in the Electorate Palatine in modern Germany, and was reportedly the first white settler in what is now Adams County, Pennsylvania. Andrew Schreiber was one of many immigrants among a burgeoning group of German settlers in Pennsylvania during the 18th century. By the time of the American Revolution, German speakers represented a third of Pennsylvania's population, while Frederick County, Maryland, the initial location of Union Mills prior to the formation of Carroll County in 1837, supported a German-speaking population of approximately 15,000, or roughly half of the county's population in 1790. Andrew Schreiber was in many ways a very typical representative of the Pennsylvania German colonial migration of the 18th century. Schreiber made the journey to Pennsylvania with his parents in 1721, 300 years ago. Like many other German immigrants, the Schreiber family first debarked in Philadelphia, a city that would be heavily impacted by German immigration throughout the 18th century, as approximately 75,000 German-speaking colonists first stepped ashore in the New World there between 1727 and 1775. Andrew Schreiber and his family settled in Pennsylvania at Goshenhappen near the Trap on the Schuylkill River. After marrying Anna Maria Kaiser in the spring of 1733, Andrew Schreiber relocated to Conewago, Pennsylvania. These two settlements at Goshenhappen and Conewago were made mostly by Germans and were among the first of that nationality in the country. David Schreiber Sr., son of Andrew Schreiber, was the first of the American-born Schreiber family members and also the root of the Schreiber lineage in Maryland. His sons, Andrew and David Schreiber Jr., would go on to found Union Mills. As the descendant of a German-born immigrant, David Schreiber Sr. is a fitting representative of the Pennsylvania German culture in the colonial era. Schreiber Sr. was born in 1735, a time when German acculturation in America had been underway for a short period. This allowed David Schreiber Sr. a timely chance to acclimatize as a naturalized German-speaking American citizen. In many ways, the story of Schreiber Sr., like his father, is a suitable representation of the Pennsylvania German cultural experience, as strictly continental values were assimilated and redefined in a process of acculturation and ethnicization that resulted in the political and social realization of a unique, wholly American identity. The story of Union Mills begins with two brothers, Andrew Schreiber and David Schreiber Jr., both sons of David Schreiber Sr. After his marriage in 1786, Andrew Schreiber continued to make his home with his wife at his father's house at Little Pipe Creek until 1791, when he moved to Littlestown, Pennsylvania, where he continued the mercantile business in communion with a public house until the year 1797. When on the 26th of June, he moved with his family, comprising 6 children, to the Mills property, bought in partnership with his brother David of the heirs of Jacob Bankert, deceased. In that same year, Andrew and David issued a construction contract to joiner Henry Colstock for the completion of 2 small houses, 14 by 17 feet each, connected by a porch and passage about 10 feet wide. Colstock was also set with the task of completing all the carpenters and joiners' work of a mill house, 40 by 50 feet, and to complete the whole thing in a sufficient and neat workmanlike manner as expeditiously as possible. Colstock's final task would be to paint the work of both dwelling and mill house in a proper and sufficient manner. To provide the raw materials for the construction of the brick mill, the Schreiber brothers entered into an agreement with Jacob Keeps and John Eckhart Jr. to mold and burn a kiln of brick to consist of 100,000 bricks or upward. Simultaneously, the two brothers contracted miller John Mung to construct a set of mills that would include a mill for manufacturing grain into flour and a sawmill, in addition to everything needful and necessary to support and connect the millworks. This initial venture established the roots of a burgeoning domestic and industrial complex that would inform the historical development of the surrounding area for generations. With the construction of a double set of mills and the foundation of a permanent homestead, the Schreiber brothers originated a site that would carry quintessential ideas of the American dream experience from the 18th century into the 21st. In christening this new economic adventure between two brothers, Andrew and David Schreiber Jr. settled on the name Union Mills to encapsulate the literal unification of the saw and grist mills, among other industrial components, into a cohesive, cooperative whole. Andrew K. Schreiber, one of Andrew Schreiber's sons, relates in a family chronicle that the partnership between the brothers suggested the name of Union Mills to their house. As early as 1799, David Schreiber Jr. relinquished his share in the complex to eventually serve as the superintendent of location and construction for the Reisterstown Turnpike. Schreiber Jr. would go on to serve as the superintendent of construction for the National Road around 1812. Andrew Schreiber stayed on at Union Mills, fathering 11 children. A 20th century descendant reports that Andrew and his brothers and sisters had a total of 265 grandchildren, many of whom lived at or visited Union Mills. Following his brother's departure from the homestead, Andrew Schreiber continued as an active politician in local and state affairs, while also operating the grist mill and tannery and maintaining a general store and post office. Following Andrew Schreiber's death at the homestead in 1847, two of his sons, Andrew K. and William, signed a mutual agreement of division in 1853, effectively putting the tannery and homestead in the former's possession and the grist mill and the mills, or the William Schreiber residence, in the hands of the latter. Andrew K. Schreiber was born in 1802 at Union Mills and lived out his entire life of 82 years in the old homestead. He founded A. K. Schreiber & Sons in 1859, which would go on to win a commendation for quality in leatherworking at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. The tannery complex would become defunct in the early 20th century. William Schreiber's sons, B.F. and T. Herbert Schreiber, managed the mill and updated its machinery in the late 19th century. The mill would eventually be conveyed to the BF Fibre Company in 1905, discussed in more detail later in the presentation. After having briefly reviewed the first few generations of the Schreiber family's history, I'd like to turn to a discussion of the site's industrial components, specifically the grist mill, miller's house, and canning and tannery complexes. Andrew and David Schreiber Jr. purchased land that included a pre-existing mill from the heirs of Jacob Bankert. According to Andrew K. Schreiber, the Bankert mill was situated on pretty much the same site as that occupied by the present mill. The contract between the Schreibers and Jacob Keeps and John Eckhart Jr. further stipulates that the kiln of brick was to be situated at Banker's old mill. The existence of an earlier mill at the same location suggests a continuing tradition that would come to define the economic environment of Union Mills in the 19th century. This continued tradition translated not only to the location of Bankert's mill, but also the Bankert family. Louis Edmund Schreiber, son of Andrew K. Schreiber, reveals that Josiah Bankert was one of the millers at Union Mills in the 19th century. The centralizing effect of the mill, then, pertained not only to the physical structure itself and the community that it inspired, but also to those families living nearby, who would continue to work at the mill and tannery complex until the discontinuation of both businesses in the 20th century. Location was all important to the establishment of a successful 18th century milling enterprise. A grist mill needed to be placed at an ideal location that could take advantage of natural sources of water power to operate effectively. The Schreiber Brothers Mill was ideally situated near the confluence of the Deep Run and the Big Pipe Creek. The twin waterways provided an ideal source of natural power to operate the grist and sawmills, while the densely forested stands of old-growth oak trees offered a substantial resource for the tannery complex that the Schreiber brothers established over the next several years. The grist mill developed by Andrew and David Schreiber Jr. was one of many at the turn of the 19th century to utilize Oliver Evans's patented automated milling technology. By 1797, Evans had already secured the third ever United States patent to be issued, had published the Young Miller Wright and Miller's Guide, and his automation had been employed at Evans's own mill on the Red Clay Creek in Delaware, in the Brandywine Flour Mills in Pennsylvania, at the Ellicott Brothers Mill on the Patapsco in Baltimore, and even at George Washington's Mount Vernon. By 1792, more than 100 mills already used Evans's automated technology. This technology did not change the way in which grain was cleaned, ground, cooled, bolted, and packed, but his innovation was more on the concept of continuous production than on the means for accomplishing it. The miller's house sits directly opposite the grist mill to its west. The original structure contains a summer beam in the Pennsylvania German architectural style that most likely dates between 1810 and 1830. While the structure was likely used as a tenant house for mill workers soon after its construction, leasehold agreements to tenant millers were issued by 1848 at the latest. The Miller's House addition, adjoining the original building to its south, dates to 1878 and housed B.F. Schreiber and his wife during the construction of Avalon, completed across the turnpike from the homestead in 1883. A porch and pantry addition were added to the east side of the Miller's House, most likely in the late 19th or early 20th century. Excavations of the Miller's House in the 1980s represent the only subsurface archaeological investigation on the Union Mills Homestead property to date. The figure to the left shows the location of the test units around the perimeter of the building. Today, the Miller's house serves as a gift shop. Benjamin Franklin, or BF Schreiber, opened Carroll County's first canning factory in 1869. Schreiber's first canning attempts at Union Mills took place in the small cooperage next to the family's grist mill. This provided both a source of power and a convenient opportunity for the disposal of waste and refuse. Like most other endeavors achieved by the Schreiber family, B.F. Schreiber's first experiment with canning began in a very homegrown fashion. Schreiber initially experimented with canning fresh vegetables in a little frame house, now, as of 1866, used for a cooper shop to manufacture flour barrels for the mill. From here, the BF Fibre Company would eventually cross to the other, or south side of the turnpike, with a proper canning factory erected around 1873 and expanded with additions and auxiliary buildings throughout the remainder of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The BF Fibre Company factory at Union Mills employed approximately 140 people during the busy season as of 1886. At that time, the company owned 170 acres in Union Mills and 135 acres in Stonersville, which produced 3,500 bushels of peas, 3,300 bushels of string beans, between 1,500 and 2,000 bushels of tomatoes, and 6,500 tons of sugar corn. BF Schreiber would purchase over 5,000 acres of farmland to grow sweet corn, string beans, tomatoes, peas, and other fruits and vegetables for canning. The company's success prompted an expansion, with factories opening in Westminster, Littlestown, Pennsylvania, New Windsor, and Sykesville. Canning operations lasted until 1969, and the BF Fibre Company farm property was sold off between 1975 and 1976. The Union Mills Cannery complex expanded several times throughout the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. According to oral history, the last remaining buildings were demolished in the 1980s or 1990s. Several concrete structures remain from the production period of the BF Fibre Cannery at Union Mills. A concrete cooling tub, several concrete piers, and an abandoned well still inhabit the landscape. The complete footprint of the standing and non-standing structures associated with the BF Fibre Canning Factory at Union Mills is shown here to the right. The last major industrial component considered in our research, and the initial focus of our research project, was the site's tannery. The tannery complex at Union Mills represents an integral part of the early industrial park setting established near the Big Pipe Creek in 1797. While the Schreiber family, and Andrew Schreiber in particular, had previous tanning experience, the available documentary evidence reviewed for this report suggests that perhaps the Union Mills tannery at first operated on a small scale, providing leather goods for travelers or locals and leather drive belts for the grist mill. A patent dated to 1813 shows that the early tannery complex employed a bark mill to extract tannins from oak bark. Tannins were used in the tanning process to make hides more water-resistant and more flexible, a process which took place in specialized tanning vats called leaches. Because the grist mill operated with the assistance of mechanized leather belts, using a system of automated machinery following the design of Oliver Evans, the tannery complex was very likely used on a localized level until the early 1820s. The period following 1824 saw an exponential increase in the production and sale of manufactured leather goods from the Schreiber Tannery at Union Mills, and marked the first time that members of the Schreiber family kept dedicated records pertaining specifically to the tannery. Leather production at Union Mills continued to increase following the death of Andrew Schreiber in 1847. While Andrew Schreiber died intestate at the age of 84, a deed dated October 12, 1853, divided his property between sons Andrew K. Schreiber and William Schreiber. Documentary evidence deriving from tax assessment records and family correspondence suggests that Andrew K. Schreiber had been operating the Union Mills Tannery as early as 1842. Andrew K. Schreiber would continue to operate the tannery at Union Mills following his father's death, eventually founding A. K. Schreiber and Sons in 1859. In that same year, the old log house, which was used for finishing leather only, was razed to the ground. The vats, which were sunk in what was called the yard, without any protection from the changes of the weather, were all repaired and many new ones added. The erection of a building to cover and protect the whole was accomplished in about 1 year. A receipt for the construction of the building from 1870, totaling $1,443.22, gives the structure's dimensions as 84 by 36 feet, with a height of 16 feet. The quaint family operation gradually evolved into a profitable venture that extended well beyond the borders of Union Mills. Under Andrew K. Schreiber's ownership, the tannery complex was modernized with steam power in the early 1860s. While Andrew K. Schreiber persisted in vegetable tanning for his leather products, the new improvements to the tannery implemented steam power as opposed to the previous method of grinding bark by horse-powered machinery. A boiler, approximately 20 feet in length and 80 feet tall, and an 80-foot tall smokestack were added to the expanding tannery complex. 5 years later, in 1875, the old bark shed was torn down and a new one constructed in its place. The latter shed is most likely the structure currently situated near the parking lot. The wide and enviable reputation of the leather produced by K Schreiber and Sons at the Union Mills Tannery, whose primary market was Philadelphia, would go on to receive a commendation at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition for quality in leatherworking in that same city. A drawing dated 1877, shown here at the top, depicts the tannery complex shortly after K Schreiber and Sons took home the 1876 Centennial Exhibition Award. Andrew K. Schreiber would die several years later, in 1884, leaving his business to sons Henry Wirt Schreiber, Louis Edwin Schreiber, and Frederick Austin Schreiber. In fact, his sons had at least partial control over the business as early as 1866, as indicated by tax assessment records from that time. The tannery would continue producing quality leather goods for the next decade. In 1894, a prolonged personal entry in Louis Edwin Schreiber's diary reveals his personal history and association with the tannery complex. Quote, owing to the dullness of trade and the small profits in leather, we have not worked in any hides in the tan yard for 2 or 3 years. This is the first time in probably 40 or 50 years that there has been no leather in the vats. How long before the war father and grandfather conducted the old yard, I don't know. But at the beginning of the 60s, over 30 years since, Wirt and Ost put in the engine and remodeled the yard, and it has been running continuously ever since. I went on in 1871 a workman and thoroughly learned the trade from beamsman to the roller table, and on the death of my brother Ost became a half partner. I have rolled nearly all the leather that the yard has turned out ever since I became proficient in that line. End quote. The defunct tannery buildings at Union Mills would continue to stand until a storm blew over the structure's smokestack on July 10, 1902. The tannery complex experienced several changes throughout the 20th century. In 1904, the boiler house and building covering the tanning vats were torn down. Around 1910, the tannery equipment was sold off and the building itself fell into disuse. In the 1970s, the beam house was also removed. The drying shed was lost to arson on October 25, 1990. Reconstruction of the drying shed took place not very long after, employing 19th century building methods. Today, the bark shed and scale house are the only original structures associated with the historic tannery complex at Union Mills. The complex's tanning vats are believed to be preserved in situ or in their original place between the extant bark shed and reconstructed drying shed. Tanning vats were an integral part of the tanning process, where hides would be soaked in a liquor derived from water and oak tannins of a progressively stronger nature as hides were transferred from one vat to the next. This was one of the final steps in the tanning process before drying and finishing. This last slide shows part of the receipt from the building covering the tan yard at the top, and a significant discovery below that, a plan view drawing of the tannery complex's original tan yard from 1827. This includes the 24 original tanning vats laid out in a rectilinear fashion. To the right is a reconfigured footprint showing the dimensions of the K Schreiber and Sons tannery, compiled from documentary and photographic evidence. We've also included a few contemporary quotes from Louis Edwin Schreiber, one of Andrew K. Schreiber's sons, who worked in the tannery, to illustrate how primary source records can help to humanize the past. These resources allow researchers to open a window that can bridge the past to the present. This is just to show the utility of a multidisciplinary approach to historical, archaeological, and architectural investigation, and its applicability in connecting researchers to a site's complicated, multi-layered history.
The Schreiber Homestead is a large and rambling house made up of several components. The oldest part is the central section of the house, consisting of 2 rooms on either side of a wide central passageway. It was actually originally constructed as a duplex for the Schreiber brothers, Andrew and David Jr. The contractor who built the house was Henry Holstock. He was from Pennsylvania. And in his contract, he was hired to build 2 small houses, 14 by 17 feet each, connected by a porch and passage about 10 feet wide. So what you're looking at in the picture on the left in this slide is that original section of the house. One of the interesting things about this earliest portion of the house that was constructed in 1797 and 1798 is that the woodwork style, the moldings, the components of that house are actually much earlier in appearance than 1798. They look more like they were built or constructed in the 1760s or 1770s. So that could mean that Mr. Colstock was maybe toward the end of his career and working with molding planes that he had purchased 20 or 30 years earlier. We just don't know, but it looks much earlier than 1798 in the type of woodwork. So that's just a little interesting feature about the house. The picture on the right of the slide is the whole house, which faces north toward the mill. And behind the house is the turnpike road that went from Baltimore to Pittsburgh. Very important route, very busy route. So this property and the house was on a major thoroughfare. Plus, it had all of the industrial activity that was going on in the immediate vicinity at the mill, at the tannery, and eventually at the cannery. This view of the homestead shows the addition that was attached to that original house that we just looked at. And this addition is on the west end of the house. And if you look carefully, you can see a vertical seam. There are 3 windows toward the left of the view and 2 windows on the right. This western addition appears to have been built fairly shortly after the original section was constructed. It has very similar woodwork, not the same, but similar. We suspect that the 3 windows to the left of that left photo on this slide, those 3 windows were probably the inn and tavern that was located on the property. The 2 windows to the right of the vertical seam on the left slide is the kitchen. And above the kitchen were sleeping rooms for the enslaved and servant members of the household. The second floor of the tavern was for overnight guests at the tavern. The view on the lower right photograph shows the back side of the kitchen wing with the large stone chimney that served the kitchen fireplace, and then it has been extended, made taller with a brick flue. This is the east addition. Actually, there are several additions at the east end of the house. The earliest is about 1820s, probably roughly contemporary with what I'm calling the Tavern addition on the west end. So this east end addition has also a kitchen. Remember, this is a duplex for the 2 Schreiber brothers. So there's a kitchen. Presumably there was a bake oven there. And then there's a shed-roofed addition to that addition with a number of windows in its south wall, and that was built much later for Bessie Schreiber as her artist's painting studio. So the homestead was a residence, a duplex, but it also had other uses. And I've already mentioned the tavern. Here are pictures of what we believe was the original tavern room. This would be in the west addition of about 1820. And the 3 views in the smaller photographs in this slide are views of that tavern room, or what we suspect to be the tavern room. It had its own separate entrance on the north side of the building so that patrons could come and go without having to enter through the main house. So it was completely separately accessible. The painting is an artist's rendering. It's a genre painting from the approximately 1830s, an American scene of a typical tavern. And so you see the bartender's cage bartender leaning over the bar, and the various patrons all looking quite happy, and someone coming in through the entrance. There's a big wood stove there, so it was a scene of a lot of activity and hopefully a lot of hilarity and good times, and we can suspect that the Schreiber Homestead's Inn and Tavern might have looked something like this when it was functioning. The vertical photograph on the right side of the slide is the second floor of the what we suspect to be the tavern area, and we see a long passageway with rooms on either side, which would have been overnight lodging rooms for patrons who needed it. And once again, this is on a major thoroughfare, major turnpike between Baltimore and Pittsburgh. There would have been a lot of freight traffic going back and forth, as well as stagecoach travelers and just individuals passing through. So it was probably a very busy place. Among the other uses of the homestead, in addition to tavern, in addition to residence, it was also a post office. The post office apparently moved around in various rooms within the house. At one point, it was in the southwest room, which would be in the original section of the house. It was also, for a time, in the entrance passageway, which was 10 feet wide. It was a fairly roomy space. And then there was another room that was served as an office, also as a general store, a magistrate's office, schoolroom, and the innkeeper's office. And that would have been the room to the east of the passageway. So there were numerous uses to the building in addition to being a residence and a tavern. The homestead also had occupants other than family and other than overnight travelers, but it also had quarters for servants and enslaved members of the household. Ruth Dewar, who was a domestic servant, enslaved domestic servant, lived in a room on the second floor at the back of the house, just directly above the kitchen on the west wing, west portion of the house. And members of her family, her nephews, Harry Dewar, slept in a finished room above that was in the attic of the west wing of the house above the kitchen.
So Paul and Paula have talked to you about the buildings to the north of the mill race, the industrial buildings, and the main domestic space, the homestead. And I'm going to talk to you about how different elements of the built landscape and the natural landscape kind of interact to create the cultural landscape. And what is a cultural landscape? The proper definition is the geographic area, which includes both cultural and natural resources associated with a historic event, activity, or person, or exhibiting other cultural or aesthetic values. So the historic cultural landscape at Union Mills comprises all of the elements which individually or collectively contribute to the landscape's appearance or significance. This includes the existing buildings, demolished or destroyed buildings, which may comprise an archaeological component beneath the surface, vegetation, including trees, shrubs, crops, topography, hills and elevation changes, circulation features like roads and pathways, walkways. And I will note here that the historic road was very important to the development of Union Mills, which is outlined in yellow, the historic alignment. Other archaeological features, which include things like waste disposal areas. We know that the mill race was dredged and the remains were placed there. And finally, cultural memory or personal memory. What do we mean by that? For example, if someone remembers an important event near a tree or a historic structure, the memory of that event is as important as the tree or structure itself. most historic properties have a cultural landscape component that is integral to its significance. But at Union Mills Homestead, we have a particularly rich array of archival evidence, photographs, and documents, which has allowed us to reconstruct a lot more of the landscape than we might at another site. And I want to definitely give credit where credit is due. Patrick Kim worked closely with Paul Albert to map out all of these features and painstakingly over the course of months, weeks and months. So I just wanted to recognize that the most of the maps are from his hard work here. So I'm going to talk to you about the domestic landscape. By that, I'm talking about the area to the south of the mill race and the industrial landscape, the area to the north of the mill race, and then talk to you briefly about some of the ways, more advanced archaeological techniques that we're using to recover information that's just beyond the reach of the written source. The main house, we often lose sight because of the focus on the industrial buildings and the mansion, the homestead. We often lose sight that Union Mills was an operating farmstead with animals, crops, and orchards. So archaeologists working on other farmsteads have found that a farmstead is usually divided into 3 concentric zones that radiate out from a dwelling. The inner active yard, which is closest to the house, which includes items, buildings that are important to the maintenance and daily operation of the farmstead. So that includes things like wells and privies. Then beyond that is the outer active yard, which includes barns, animal pens, and other agricultural outbuildings. And finally, beyond that, we have the peripheral inactive yard, which includes fields and pastures. So why are we as archaeologists so concerned about this theoretical distinction? Well, it does help, it does assist in planning. If we are able to use this turquoise area as a domestic buffer, we call it a domestic buffer. If we're able to use that and say, archaeological investigations that need to take place within this area are going to be slightly more intensive and expensive than archaeological excavations that fall outside of it, that is useful information in regards to planning. So the domestic landscape of Union Mills is somewhat distinctive from these general patterns. First of all, several of the more utilitarian buildings like wells, the ice house, fall outside of the normal area of the interactive yard. They're just a bit further than we might expect them to be. The domestic and agricultural buildings are spread out over a much larger area and convey a natural, more organic development suited to the needs of the family. It almost seems as if the house is almost decentralized, and that the road system running through the property is a much more important has a much more important gravitational pull towards the buildings. They're never situated, with the exception of these kind of stragglers. Most of the buildings are situated about 20 feet away from the old road system. One interesting item to us is this structure here, which initially to us the function was conveyed that it was a chicken house at one point. And this may be true, but given its kind of proximity away from the main house, and it's near a well that's far away from the main house, this evidence may indicate that at some point it might have served a residential function. We're not exactly sure, and archaeological investigations might shed more light on this, but that's down the road. So with one possible exception to the south of the mill race, to the north of the mill race, all of the domestic and agricultural buildings are located to the south of the mill race. So this appears to convey this conceptual division between work and kind of domestic space. And that works spatially from an aerial perspective. But when we get down to the details of the landscape, this distinction completely falls apart. In contrast to the sprawling domestic landscape, the industrial area just to the north of the mill race conveys a planned environment in which the buildings are clustered together tightly to maximize their potential and their respective purposes. So first of all, the Schreibers manipulated the natural landscape by diverting water from Big Pipe Creek into the mill race. And then the grist mill and the sawmill were both constructed on the same mill race to maximize their efficiency and minimize their cost. The grist mill operated initially with the assistance of leather belts, which were produced right here in the Tannery complex right next door. The cooper shop manufactured flour barrels for the mill. The blacksmith shop cast and repaired mill parts, reshoed horses that were powering the bark mill, and fixed wagons that were used to deliver products to the mill and to move out finished products out for sale. The later cannery complex that Paul had mentioned, which is to the south of the turnpike, was built directly over the mill race to carry off refuse from the factory. So all of these elements variously interacted as nodes in a network designed to produce and sell commodities to the public. And the efficiency of the system conveys more of a modern industrial mindset far ahead of its time and more characteristic of the post-Civil War period. On first glance, the north-south divide between the domestic and industrial spheres appears to convey this ideological separation of public and private space, which would characterize much of the architecture of the 19th century. There might have been something like this involved in the thought process behind the planning, but when you look at it from this perspective, this is an aerial photo, a bird's eye aerial photo from the 1950s. In reality, these two worlds were intimately connected and inseparable, and I think this photo shows this in a better way than an aerial view, an overhead view. For example, there would be no escaping the smell from the tannery complex when somebody goes out in the front yard in the morning at the homestead, nor the sounds of the machinery in action in the mill. In addition, this now very unassuming road running through the property must have been a major thoroughfare. There must have been a constant parade of people coming in and out. Paula has already mentioned the tavern and the post office that were actually within the house itself, but people coming off the turnpike, delivering products to the mill and then leaving, it must have been constant activity. So much so, a person standing on a wagon could reach out and touch this white picket fence that delineates the outer yard of the homestead. So they are one and the same space, even if conceptually we like to talk about them separately. While an unusually large quantity of primary documentary records are available to us that we were able to use to reconstruct the historic landscape, archaeological information is still an invaluable source of information that's just beyond the reach of the written sources. So excavation all over the homestead is not feasible. It's not cost effective, and archaeology is inherently destructive. If we excavate a building, we destroy what's left of that building, even though we're getting information about it. So excavation is not the best option generally to recover information about a landscape at the scale of landscape. But what we do use is something called remote sensing within archaeology to explore these questions that we have, archaeological questions that we have. One of the most basic forms of remote sensing is actually one that we've used throughout this presentation, and that is just the examination of aerial photographs. Another remote sensing technique that we often use is the collection and analysis of airborne LiDAR data, that is light detection and ranging. LiDAR works by attaching an instrument to an aerial device, an airplane or drone, and illuminating, which illuminates the surface, illuminates a target, which is in this case, which is straight down. With a laser light and measuring the reflection with a sensor. Differences in laser return times and wavelengths can then be used to render a 3D representation of the surface. And this works particularly well in areas of dense tree canopies where we're not able to see what's beneath on aerial photos. And this is a particularly nice example of the Mayan city of Carroll in Belize. This is all these buildings that you can see very clearly here are under a dense tree canopy, not visible, in an airplane. So Maryland is one of the states, several states, which has made their statewide LiDAR data set available to the general public. So anybody can do this. It's something that we do before any survey that we do. So our results, unfortunately, were slightly less spectacular. We did locate two interesting anomalies here using the LiDAR surface data, the surface models. And the first one here is slightly more convincing than this one. This one turned out to be nothing, apparently. This is a large trapezoidal feature that may or may not be associated with a historic animal enclosure. We know that there are cattle, mules, horses kept on the property. The horses were kept to the south, so this may have been a seasonal enclosure for cattle or something. At any rate, at some point they just took down all the fences and just let the cattle run free in this area. So we're not exactly sure. We know a little bit more than we did before we looked at this, but the results were not what we had hoped for. Another remote sensing technique that was used was thermal imaging. So this was conducted by Hurley Technologies in February and secured by the Homestead Foundation in support of our work. Thermal imaging works because over the course of a day and night, different parts of the landscape heat up and cool down at different rates. So a thermal camera is able to capture that information that's invisible to the naked eye. Buried stones, for example, tend to retain heat longer than the dry soil around them does. And those temperature differences are invisible to our eyes. So if the buried stones happen to be part of a building, we've just captured an image of a historic building. So this is one example where it works really nicely in Germany, almost invisible crop marks there. And then a Roman villa shows up when we look at the thermal imaging. Again, our results were less spectacular. What this survey had set out to do was to locate the tanning vats that we believe are right here and may exhibit a signature that is associated with the fact that there's stones or bricks underneath the surface. We could try another time on a cold day, a warmer day. It was a particularly cold day that day, but we had something else in mind. So with a mini grant provided by the Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area, we are planning on undertaking a ground penetrating radar survey in the location where we believe, in that same area, where we believe the tanning vats are located. GPR works by sending out tiny pulses of energy into the ground, and then an integrated computer system records the strength and time required for the signal to return. And then these signals are shown here in something called a radargram, and an experienced technician can read this and locate anomalies. So the anomalies are usually areas where the soil or what is beneath the surface is less dense or more dense than the surrounding materials. So in this particular case, areas of less dense soil indicate possible burials in the ground. So what we are planning on doing is locating some of those anomalies, finding the best example, and then excavating a 3-foot by 3-foot test unit in that location. And in this way, we are able to use the minimum amount of disturbance to determine the presence, condition, construction methods, and capacity of the tanning vats, which were vital to the industrial development of Union Mills. So with that, I will turn things back over to Elizabeth.
As a summary, let's look at why Union Mills is important. The wealth of the Schreiber primary source documents is really amazing. The original furnishings in the homestead are second to none. The family stewardship over multiple generations, and throughout the site, the multi-layered cultural resources above ground and below ground. The site is emblematic of domestic, agricultural, industrial, vertical integration in the early 19th century. It's a microcosm of the value of a multidisciplinary approach to historical, architectural, and archaeological research in cultural resource management. And it's a laboratory for high-tech applications now and in the future. Very importantly, it's a heritage tourism destination of regional, state, and national importance. And 2021 is the 300th anniversary of the Schreiber family's initial arrival in the New World. So the Union Mills complex is part of a larger historic district, as we've explained. It's made up of distinct components which together form a cohesive and exceptionally significant industrial, commercial, and residential unit associated with multiple generations of a distinguished American family. Our key findings include that the site's historical and cultural resources provide a complete and distinctive story of the construction and evolution of an industrial, commercial, and residential complex outstanding in Maryland in the 18th and 19th centuries. Our research is helping to establish the national significance of Union Mills. We've been able to demonstrate earlier dates for the Eastern additions to the homestead, and we've identified key areas of archaeological sensitivity and potential, and we've researched connections with the descendant community. Our recommendations for future work include preparation of an updated historic structures report for the buildings and a preservation plan for the future. Our recommendations for the future include preparation of an updated historic structures report and preservation plan, preparation of a cultural landscape study for the grounds in and around the complex, a ground penetrating radar or GPR survey combined with below ground archaeological testing to explore the Tannery complex's vats. And this project has already received funding through the Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area mini grant. And then finally, the potential nomination as a National Historic Landmark. And this research has included a designation of the boundaries that encompass the site's 18th and 19th century domestic and industrial core. And then most importantly in the future, a study of the enslaved and free labor that was very much a part of all of Union Mills history. These are some selected references that we would like to share with you. And I'll point out that this PowerPoint will be available. So if you are unable to grab them now and you're interested, they will be available in the future. We'd like to acknowledge our partners who are listed here, and also note that our email is listed. If you have any questions, we'd like to hear them this evening. But if you think of something later, please feel free to email us and we'll be happy to answer. Thank you so much, and we'll be happy to take your questions now.
Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. That was fantastic. And we do have a couple of questions that have come in. One is about the original trees. Are there any original trees that are still on the property?
I'll take that one just because I know that one pretty well. There's a sycamore tree that is sitting right along the highway, right along Route 97, the old turnpike. That is a massive tree. It's between the William Schreiber house and the where we do the corn roast every year. And that's probably our most likely witness tree. And then another very large tree was the ash tree that was over on the Lions Club portion of the property, which was an agricultural field for the in the homestead complex, and that was removed about 3 years back.
Another question is, thank you, Sam, someone is interested to know the areas that the cannery served, and they are thanking you for a very interesting program.
Again, I'll just jump in on that because that's at least I can speak to the 20th century, not the 19th century. Certainly the 20th century, the BF Fibre Company was selling products nationwide and had a very wide distribution. I just remember being a kid and seeing those cans on the shelves in grocery stores wherever you went. In the 19th century, that's a little bit more an area of research. Is probably much more likely regional, and maybe Paul can speak to that.
Thanks, Sam. So yeah, the cannery's distribution wasn't really part of our initial research focus. We focused more on where the BF Schreiber cannery was present in terms of its location at Union Mills and Westminster and a few of its other locations. So that would be an additional research question to assess.
Okay, well, thank you both. We do have a couple of more questions coming in. Is the site available for the public to view?
I can answer that, and I know Sam can as well. And the answer is yes. It is a heritage tourism destination for Carroll County, and of course, beyond Carroll County, people come from really all over. And one of the things that we have tried to establish or have established as part of our study is that when you come to Union Mills, a lot of people just focus on the amazing house and the furnishings in it, which are second to none. But beyond that, in the cultural landscape, as Rob has pointed out, and Paul and Paula, there is so much more. And so when you look at the property as a whole and look at the landscape, the buildings and the mill race, the miller's house, it all paints a picture of, as we said, vertical integration of an industrial complex in the 19th century. So the short answer is yes, it's accessible, but it's accessible on many levels. And so we, and I know we would encourage people to come and experience that themselves, in addition to, of course, the amazing mill structure and the house.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth.
I might just jump in there to Dorothy to say that if you have questions as to the tour hours and all that type of detail, you can go to the website at unionmills.org, where the hours are for the touring season, which is typically during the warmer months.
Great, thank you. Another question, can you show on a map where the cannery was relative to the mill and the tannery? And the person saying that they understand that it was on the other side of the road and alongside the tail race. Is that right?
I think that is one for Rob and Paul to jump in, perhaps. And I'm not sure they can reshare a map right now, but we can certainly follow up with correspondence after this and share a map, but we can also explain it.
Yeah, that's correct. The cannery was across the road and built right over the mill race to facilitate the the carrying off of waste. So it was not in the main industrial area, the north of the mill race that was shown in the earlier maps. I think Paul had a map which it was kind of zoomed in, but that area is across the road and to the southwest of the main complex.
Great.
One way of looking at it is to say that if you drive in the front driveway there at Union Mills and you are looking at that mill, the mill race, you literally cross over the mill race as you go past the mill. And if you look to your left, which would be to the west, that is on the other side of the turnpike is where the cannery was located. I would note that that portion of the property is in private hands. It's not part of the public park. So in answer to one of the other questions about what's accessible and what's not, only the portions that are in the public park are accessible.
Our next question, what can you say about the historic significance of the Mills technology?
I'd like to throw that one at Paula, if she wouldn't mind, to talk about the Oliver Evans technology, and perhaps Paul as well, because I know that this is something that we've looked at extensively. And while there were many mills in the 19th century, Union Mills has some unique aspects.
And it certainly does, partly because of its early age. It was built in 1797. Oliver Evans patented his milling machinery and milling system, and it was the third U.S. patent, so that was in 1790 that he did that, and he had been developing it even before that. He also had patents in Maryland, so it is very significant, and the fact that it's still there and still intact, along with everything else on that site that is still there and still intact, makes it really quite remarkable.
Great, thank you. This is a question from Facebook, somebody from Facebook, wondering about the Civil War military landscape. Any understanding where Jeb Stuart had his 6,000 soldiers, 400 wagons on June 30th, 1863 on his way to Gettysburg, Hanover? And the second part of that question is want to know where men slept and the general layout.
Paul, I think that's a good one for you to take. And I think it's also interesting to point out that one of the accounts that we have of the enslaved at Union Mills concerns looking out the window and seeing troops come into the complex. But Paul, I'll throw that one at you if you wouldn't mind, please.
Okay, yeah, great. So Union Mills was certainly an important location for both Confederate and Union troops on their way to what would become the Battle of Gettysburg. And I apologize that I don't have my notes pulled up, but to my memory, Jeb Stuart and his troops stayed in the area that was the orchard, if I remember correctly, and there are accounts of some of the soldiers sleeping on the porches of the homestead. I believe those were Union troops. And as I put in one of my slides, the brothers, K Schreiber and William Schreiber, actually held opposite allegiances during the Civil War. So the Confederate troops were quartered more with William Schreiber, and the Union troops who came after Jeb Stuart's soldiers passed through were quartered more with K Schreiber at the main homestead.
Great. I think we're having...
Very briefly on that with the thousands of soldiers that were present on that site, it is likely that the entire landscape was used by those two armies. I mean, we're talking with the 5th Corps of the Union Army there, it was a massive amount of soldiers that would have been in that landscape.
Okay, the next question is Maria Schreiber, a descendant of the original Schreibers, and the person's making the comment that their niece is getting married in October 2021 at Union Mills, and she's very excited.
Again, I can jump on that one real quick just because I know the genealogy pretty well. Maria's father was R. Sergeant Schreiber Jr., who was born in Westminster. Her grandmother was Hilda Schreiber, who was born in the William Schreiber house, and her great-grandfather would have been T. Herbert Schreiber, who was one of the partners of the BF Fibre Company cannery. So yes, Maria is descended from the Union Mills.
And I'll
Right.
jump in and just say that I think that's an excellent example of the reason that research such as we have undertaken is so important, because it brings a history to life that people are interested in. There's obviously a reason why this particular person has decided that they want to hold arguably one of the most important events of their life at Union Mills. And Union Mills has been the site of events such as that for, you know, multiple generations, and hopefully obviously will continue to be. But I think it's emblematic of the heritage tourism and the heritage the understanding of the history and the deep layers of history that a site like this has, not just for the Schreiber family, but for a much wider you know, casting a much wider net.
Okay, we're having a number of questions come in. Maybe we can get to 2 more. Thanks for a great presentation. Was the family able to fish in the rivers that powered the mill?
I'm not sure we have an account through the oral history or in, you know, sometimes it's the things like that that are like making pancakes in the morning that are the pieces of everyday life that all of us experience, but we overlook the opportunity to write those down or make note of those for either our generation or future generations. Although those are, of course, the very meat of what, you know, is life on an everyday basis. I would venture to say that fish within the mill race was a very, very probable, you know, happening, if you will, fishing in the mill race. But I'm not sure that I have not seen an account of that event specifically.
Okay,
Sorry, I don't know that it would be a really good idea, because you would have canning waste, later canning waste, a lot of noxious kind of chemicals from the industrial waste going into the mill race. So if they tried fishing there, that would be really interesting. We would like to find an account of that, but yeah, I don't know. It would be a very risky undertaking.
thank you, Rob. I think this will be our last question. Any evidence that the Schreibers brewed their own beer or spirits to serve in the tavern from the grain they produced at the mill?
Do we have an answer for that question? It's a really good one. And I think there's some potential there for a heritage tourism destination reboot, Sam, if you are able to find the recipe and, you know, and begin again that we know there was, you know, a lot of industry going on, yet that would be another layer that we could add to their industrial development, but I'm not sure we have that information.
Research still to be done.
There you go. And with that, we're going to close out. And I'll share my screen one more time here to have our final slide. And Sam, did you want to say, to have some closing remarks? Oh, could you unmute there, Sam?
There we go. So I'm sorry. I wanted to thank you, Elizabeth, Rob, Paula. This was a huge amount of information, and it presented with such incredible detail for us. I should note these reports are extensive. Thank you so much for all the wonderful work. We've got so much more work to do ourselves. We know that this is just the start of a long process, to put these recommendations into action. We know that, so stay tuned, everybody. Two other brief comments. I'd be remiss if I did not recognize our Executive Director, Jane Sewell, who is retiring on February 1st after 20 years of dedicated service. We are where we are today because all she has done for us in terms of her leadership. So thank you, Jane. We do appreciate that. And then finally, thank you again to the Carroll County Public Library and to the Community Media Center, and particularly thank you to you, Dorothy Stoltz, for all that you did to make this possible. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Sam. And thank you, Elizabeth, and the entire research team for such an informative and exciting report about this wonderful project. It's been a long time coming, and we were honored to be part of it. And many thanks to everyone for joining us this evening.